So now, okay, great. Now we're officially starting the session, and then team, I'll toss the mic to you. Could you please introduce yourself and also start your presentation?
Thanks very much, Kyungmee, and thanks to everyone for having me. I'm going to try not to assume that you've carefully read the paper and try to kind of explain it a bit for those who might not have gone line by line through it. Just to start off by saying it's nice to be in a group that is so welcoming, because I, like probably all of you, are having a strange and unsettled time. It's pretty likely that some or all of my children will come and interrupt me during this presentation. Haven't had the same kind of thinking space to prepare, and so it will probably be quite informal. But I'm looking forward to it, and actually, having had your introductions first, I think we could equally have had this session talking about your fascinating various research interests. As Kyungmee said, it's hard to pin down exactly what my core topic is of research. And that's either because I've got a sort of curious and exploratory attitude, or it's because I'm not very good at planning. I'm not sure which side of the fence I'm sitting on there, but my PhD thesis was on digital photography and memory, and it sort of went at the crossroads of psychology and philosophy, distributed cognition, for example, media studies, and things like that. And basically, I used photo elicitation interviews to talk to people about how the ways that they engage with photography related to memory, and came up with a sort of model of how I think memory can be understood in relation to media. But that has very little to do with today's talk, except that the sort of mind-bending problems that I had to grapple with in that PhD, I think have informed the thinking that I do in education. And I took quite a complex view of memory and photography and interaction there, and that sort of stayed with me, leading up through various different types of educational research to this paper that I'm talking about today on ecological evaluation, and thinking about how education is also such a complex tapestry of practices and contextualized interactions and activity. As for my day job, I teach on the Masters in Clinical Education at the University of Edinburgh, which is a fully online program for healthcare practitioners who are wanting to build up some educational principles in their own teaching. And I work with some really good colleagues there, two of whom are co-authors on this paper. So Jill Aitken and Derek Jones. I'm sort of representing all three of them. Although I think they might say that this was kind of, I kind of went off on one here and then sort of dragged them with me, because they do, I think, have more coherent approach to educational research. But anyway, here I am talking about evaluation, partly because I think we as a team talk a lot about our online program. And we talk about what's important, and we find ourselves quite dissatisfied with the ways in which programs are evaluated, even though our program actually does well enough, or pretty well in terms of the standard evaluation. It doesn't. We just found that those evaluations did not help us much in developing as teachers and developing our programs, and that's kind of where this came from. Let me just pause there and say, is there anything else I should say by way of introduction before I launch into the presentation?
No, I think it's great. We can just move on to presentation part now.
All right, let me just see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you can all see what I'm seeing, which is a slide that says ecological teaching evaluation versus the datafication of quality, understanding education with and around data. Maybe I could have come up with a catchier title or a shorter title. Yes. Anyway, there it is. So there's my details, Jill's details, Derek's details, the program that we are on, and feel free to get in touch with me after this session to talk about either what we do or the research or memory or anything you like. I think part of the value of these things is to build up some contacts. I'm going to try not to just talk at you for too long. I really want the discussion to be the biggest part of this. And part of that is because these are fairly complicated topics and I don't have all the answers. And actually what I need to do is talk to people who are in, other settings and with different approaches to try and think through some of these aspects. So hopefully you will have seen this first paper on the left, which is the one I'm talking about. And it sort of draws on the perspective that is that I've talked about in the paper on the right, which is called Postdigital Education in Design and Practice. I won't talk too much about that, except to say that for me, the post-digital perspective is one in which there isn't really such a thing as online learning independently of social and material context in which people are engaging in activity. So you're not really learning online, you're learning with online resources and using online communication, but the learning itself is not online, it's still physical, it's still embodied, it's still social, and it is still caught up in all of these other contextual factors, the economics of the politics and the culture and traditional practices and infrastructures of the university, etc. So the post-digital perspective for me is just making sure people remember that actually online learning is still connected into the world in really complicated ways and can't just be isolated and thought about as a totally separate reality. Moving on to datafication of education. So I have said in my paper that datafication involves, or we have said, I should say, sorry, that datafication involves the progressive transformation of social and material elements and activity into digital data, followed by the treatment of that data as equivalent to its original source. So the idea here is that you have all of these complex kinds of activity that are going on in education, and slowly but surely you turn different aspects of that into some sort of digital data, and then you treat that digital data as if it is the thing itself. Here I have a picture of a sound wave that is kind of being quantized. So the sound, which is actually, the vibration of the vibration on the ear, which represents some sort of interaction with a complex physical reality, is being made two-dimensional, and then it is being made kind of quantified in terms of discrete steps. The smoothness and the complexity is taken out of this so that it can be represented in binary numbers. And in Jared Lanier's book, You Are Not a Gadget, he has this interesting example of MIDI. Before the existence of MIDI, which is a way of representing musical notation through digital data, you thought of music in a particular way. And then after the introduction of this MIDI interface, where suddenly music could be described in these digital terms of the frequency and the amplitude and the timing, etc., in really clear fashion, it was then kind of impossible to go back and think of music as this ephemeral and intangible and complex thing that it was before. And I think the same thing is true of any kind of datafication. So here on the right, I've just got a spreadsheet. That is not real student data, just to be clear, where you have students turned into their numbers and the particular skills and capacities that they've apparently demonstrated in assessment are turned into numbers, and those numbers are then turned into an overall number about the quality of their work. And that's just one example of many of the ways in which we're slowly datafying different aspects of the educational process. There are others. So we talked in our paper about the rising tide of measurement, quantitative analysis of educational elements. So it's sort of slowly but steadily happening to more and more elements. And the examples that I've put up here are marks, student satisfaction ratings, workload surveys, attendance monitoring, sickness absence records, the administration of student support systems, marking turnaround times, learning analytics, something I can't read, plagiarism scores, contact hours. And I'm wondering, and we can talk about this in the discussion once I've stopped talking at you for a bit, what other types of datafication you can think of. But part of the point I want to make here is that it's not that any one of these things is bad, it's just that slowly the picture of what constitutes education is becoming made up of these very fine-grained, datafied bits of information. And every time you do this, you sort of separate them out from all the things that they are normally entangled with. And just, I won't dwell too much on this. There's a lot that could be said about the kind of politics and the economics behind this. And actually, I'm not arguing that datafication is a result of consumerism and neoliberalism, but I do think that sort of neoliberal agendas can drive forward this datafication towards certain agendas. And notably, transparency and accountability are two of the things that are espoused in neoliberal education. Trust, I think, slowly becomes replaced by accountability so that you can monitor what's being done more easily, and you can govern and regulate and control it more easily by using these datafied measures as kind of benchmarks around which decisions can be made. And importantly, a lot of things don't show up very clearly in any of this data. And as the governance of education revolves more and more around data, that which isn't represented in the data becomes marginalized. And we have things like a culture of performativity where teachers and students and other stakeholders can orient their activity and their efforts towards increasing the numbers that are represented in that data, rather than actually doing what they would think was important from a more sort of philosophical place or according to their values. And in all of that, I think sometimes the actual purpose of education becomes lost. And I think some of the activities that we do move in a direction that is actually in opposition, or at least not aligned with a lot of the research, the pedagogical research and scholarship that we see coming out. So a really easy example is grade inflation. If you want to improve your student satisfaction scores, then give students higher grades, or give them chocolates just before you deliver a satisfaction survey, and suddenly it will look like the quality of your course is higher than it would have otherwise. So in terms of what I think might be a useful response to this, we've proposed something that we've called ecological evaluation, and that for us is a form of evaluation that takes into account complexity, holism, and relations between elements. So rather than looking at these metrics that are kind of isolated and disaggregated and taken out and looked at by themselves, we want to think more about the whole picture of everything that comes together to produce education. It's a form of evaluation that values complementarity of information sources. So I think it's a really good idea in evaluation to look at lots of different information sources, like student satisfaction ratings and outcomes and all of the data, but also talk to people and qualitative information sources. And don't just think of them independently, but think about how one relates to another. So for example, if you see that student satisfaction is down at the moment, what other information sources can help you understand that? For example, oh, actually that happened during a pandemic would be one good example there. This evaluation also sees responsibility as distributed across teachers, students, institutions, and contexts. So that's the idea that no one stakeholder is really in control of the quality of education, partly because the quality of education is actually different for every student, depending on how they've engaged with it, what their circumstances are, how appropriate it is for their particular needs and conditions, etc. Partly because actually when you design something, it never manifests in exactly the way that you intended. Both teachers and students go off and do different things to interpret the tasks and interpret the goals and interpret the ways in which the design thought that things should take place. And they will realize that according to their own needs and goals, which might be slightly different from those that were espoused by the curriculum designers in the first place. But also all of this happens in an institutional context where policies and infrastructures and technologies that are available and the environments that are provided may or may not help the quality of that education in different ways. And in online education, it's even more complicated because the quality of education has to take into account the circumstances of every different student in a different physical location with different resources, different home environments. Do their kids keep coming in and interrupting them like they do, like mine do? And various other contextual factors to do with the backgrounds of the students and the backgrounds of the teachers, and etc. So essentially, it's evaluation in a way that does not think of education as a sort of linear input-output system where you use a particular method by the book and it will lead to certain types of outcomes. So I've only got 2 more slides, I promise. Why do we need to evaluate in this way? To avoid reductionism and instrumentalism. So that's what I was just talking about, really. The instrumental view of technology in education, for example, is that if we buy this software package, it will lead to these better outcomes, or this particular software or technological package is a solution to a problem in and of itself, outside of the way that it's used. So we want to avoid that because we want to understand how technology or methods or different teaching practices or whatever you want to evaluate, how does it operate embedded in a complex ecology of existing cultures and traditions and infrastructures and various influencing factors that will have an influence, will shape the education that happens, and how does it kind of integrate into what's already there. We also want, we think this kind of evaluation to understand how to improve education beyond focusing on isolated elements. So rather than just evaluating the teacher or the method or the task or the kind of assessment, we don't really think that quite works because of what I said before about nothing being really in complete control of what's happening, and how actually it's the relational combination of things that produces education, and we need to understand that in its full picture. And also because this kind of evaluation, I think, can identify challenges and opportunities at different levels. So the micro level, where people are actually working in a course together, and the meso level, which it might be like program level, which will involve some of the program policies and practices, and exo and macro, so building out the way to where you are at institutional level and actually the wider kind of political economic climate. You can identify the challenges that come into the quality of education by looking at all these different levels and how they interact. So again, the fact that all of this is happening in a pandemic is a good example of why you might want to look beyond a micro level when you are evaluating some education. That all sounds good to me, but it's hard. So what do we need to evaluate in this way? I think we need to have some sort of clarity of educational purposes and values. So what's this education for? I don't think all education can really just be at producing a particular type of graduate with particular skills. There's a lot of education that's oriented around learning outcomes at the moment, but that isn't really enough. It doesn't capture everything that we need. Particularly in this time, we need some sort of development of appreciation of social justice and critical thinking and complexity, and these things that just won't be captured in the curriculum, in the specified curriculum, or at least won't be neatly captured. We need protection from false measurement and misaligned monitoring. So the idea that actually we need to protect our teachers and our students from judgments that are made on the basis of information that is incomplete or misleading. And a good example of that might be in learning analytics, where you, based on patterns of past students, generalized patterns of past students who didn't do well and had a pattern of engagement that was similar to, you know, another student's pattern of engagement, actually judging their learning on the basis of that is really problematic because of the diversity of ways in which students engage. So basically, being careful not to create false impressions of what's going on the basis of isolated and flawed metrics. And the other thing is that we need agency and expertise from multiple stakeholders. I think that students and teachers and administrators and central institutional people all need to have some sort of understanding of how complex education is and all the different things that feed into it. And they all need to be involved in this kind of evaluation in order to create multiple perspectives to build this bigger picture. So that was a whirlwind tour through the thinking behind the paper and some of the concepts. The devil is in the detail, and I think that's maybe where the discussion is going to be really helpful, because I would like to hear from you about some of the ways in which you think your educational practice is being datafied, some of the ways in which it isn't being datafied, and that, you know, that maybe the whole thing isn't just becoming this massive data, but how do we reconcile those two things? And your thoughts about some of the challenges to this conception and actually to the implementation or the practice of ecological evaluation. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, or if you weren't listening, thank you for pretending to listen. And I'm hoping that you'll all help me talk this through, because I don't know all the answers. I recognize it's very challenging. So in some ways, this paper is a provocation and a starting point for thinking. Thanks.
Thanks, team. That was like very lovely, concise 20-minute presentation. Appreciate that. And it looks like you posed two important questions. So first of all, you kind of, so we can have probably for a couple of minutes to think about two discussion questions posed by a team. So the first one is, which part of our practice, whether it's teaching or design or learning, we have different people here, which part of our practice is datafied, which part isn't? So which part is like hidden and which part is more obvious? And the second one is like this seemingly very, very ambitious project called like Ecological Evaluation. So what will be challenging that we'll try to, when we try to do that, it will be a challenge that we'll likely face. So we can come, each of us can have a couple of minutes to think about our own practice and then our kind of initial reaction to this new notion of ecological evaluation. And then we can probably open the floor to everyone to speak up. All right. So while we're having a little thought, Sezin shouted it here. So Sezin, do you want to, if we have any kind of burning question about the presentation or anything related to paper, you can also ask question to team. So Sejin, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed your presentation. I didn't pretend to listen to your presentation. I really listened. So my research is actually about teacher and their use of technology. So recently, me and Kyungmee together worked with the roles of theory in TEL research, technology enhanced learning, and one of the thesis was one of the papers was talking about a model. It's called SQD model. I can share the my screen, and okay, so it looks like this. Can you see it? Hello? Can you see the model?
Yes, we can now. Thanks.
Right. So it's called model, and it's called evidence. So it creates factors in preparing pre-service teachers so that they can use technology. So they have various circles, and I think this is kind of the approach. Try to simulate or to visualize and conceptualize what you mentioned as the ecological view, because it has the internal factors and the exo factors as well. So what I want to ask is how do you see then this kind of trend in scientific research, where researchers want to make things that which were undatafiable and turning them into datafiable factors or some concepts so that they can integrate in our evaluation system. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Sejin. I like the model. I don't. Is it possible to keep the model up just for a minute?
Oh yeah, I can share. Sorry.
So I like the fact that the model looks at these different levels of abstraction from practice. And I will say that I'm not arguing that research isn't doing a good job of understanding complexity, because there's actually lots of research, more and more research, especially from the sort of socio-material tradition, complexity theory and various things that are doing a good job of understanding how education works. It's just that we then still evaluate in really simplistic fashions that don't represent that complexity. You know, the teaching excellent framework, which fortunately isn't happening by the looks of things, was all based on national student survey data. I mean, we could go into that in depth, but the questions that are asked there are not taking complexity into account. They're really just kind of asking simplistic questions, not allowing any sort of expansion on those by getting the kind of nuanced perspective even of the students, and they don't connect it to other information sources very well. And they use outcome measures and employment measures and things like that. And all of these things don't really get at what's actually happening in the education that's going on. I think your model probably is a way of doing that, but then how do you get that model or any model of complexity to be represented in institutional evaluation practices? And I think you can't really get away from the need for different stakeholders to actually understand some of this pedagogical theory that underpins it, because you could roll out a model, like a prescriptive model of how to evaluate, but then the blind following of that model would sort of undermine it, because it probably requires some sort of judgments to be made and some kind of explanations to be given by like the students and the teachers. And so I think some sort of combination of producing templates and tools for people to use to analyze the complex interrelation of different elements that go into education, and also some sort of work probably involving a lot of dialogue in helping people understand why they're doing that and what it means. I think we kind of need some sort of combination of that. If you get to the problem of how you should compare courses and institutions, then I'm kind of at a loss there, because I don't know politically how we would get to the point where we could do that with and still represent complexity. So I guess one question is, should we do it at all, or should we try and do something different? But then you've got the landscape, the political economic landscape that we have. So I'm not quite sure. I think maybe you need to do this sort of instrumental evaluation, but don't get too caught up in it as an educator, because if you start sort of engaging in that culture of performativity where you're chasing higher numbers, you probably aren't doing the right things to actually improve the quality of your education. And so I think we need to kind of have faith that doing the things that we think are actually going to improve educational quality will hopefully manifest in higher numbers. I think I totally went away from your question there, but it was a good provocation for me anyway. And do let me know if you would like a more concise and precise answer.
Thank you for your answer. I mean, I just came up this this question because this is what I found by looking at all the like related like articles, because they were trying to like find the concept, and they want to datafy it to manage or to govern like teachers so that they can be good at using technology. So that's the point where I can resonate my findings to your work. So that's the point of my question, because I found the kind of same trend in our research practices, and I wanted to ask how you think about this kind of the trend that we see together. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks. I think Tunda has asked question on chat. Tunda, do you want to ask the question in person?
Yeah, so I mean, I was just as you were talking, Tim, thank you so much. The just wondered whether you feel, or what your thoughts are, whether perhaps there is a difference between internal and external evaluation. So I've sat on a number of panels when program teams have to assemble all the data they've got about their course and then justify or suggest changes and reflect on what works and what doesn't. And it does allow them agency, and they can create their own narratives. So in a way, they are doing all those interactional analyses that you're talking about. Whereas, you know, if the same program appeared on a league table, then you don't have that narrative. So I was going to ask what you were leading on as well at the end of your presentation, of the detailed question of, have you got examples of where you think things have worked well, which you would consider ecological, and perhaps examples when you don't. So sorry, that's another question as well.
Thank you. I think the first one is a great question. So is the second one, but on the assumption that I probably will forget what the second one was by the time
Don't worry.
I'm finished. Mostly my fault, because as Sejin just found, I don't really stick to the question that closely. Apologies for that. But anyway,
no, just keep with the first one. Yeah, that's
so anyway, is there a difference between internal evaluations for periodic reviews of programs versus external ones? Yeah, definitely. I think that anyone who's really kind of into their own educational practice would definitely do different ones. So on our program, we have the standardized things that we need to do for the university, which involve mostly student satisfaction surveys around like a small set of questions that most of us don't like. But you know, you have to kind of engage in that process. And then we do the things that we actually do like, which is mostly talking to students. So, you know, we don't do evaluation at the end of the course. We just do it all the time by talking to our students about how they understand tasks and what they think of different approaches and how are they coping as students and what would they do differently. Even asking for their choices of what to do during the course so they can help us construct the learning activities. So through all that, you are evaluating your educational practice and you're getting to understand the contexts of your students and the needs and goals of your students better. And then we do things like research projects. And I understand that not everyone can do this. We're an educational program, so it's, you know, it's much easier for us to conduct educational research. And often we do that on our own program by having conversations with our students. And some of the papers that came out of our group are based on interview studies with our own students, in which we don't necessarily say, what did you think of our course? But can you tell us about what you now think is important about your own educational practice or something like that? And from there, you can understand something about the mechanisms that were important. For example, having an online community in which different perspectives in different countries and different disciplines are shared together, and then you get a sort of sense of how you might be able to shape your own practice, and then things about how the learning that they're doing manifests in the workplace, and how are they able to create, you know, to enhance the agency and authority that they have to make changes in their workplace, and how do they think that's come about. And one of the problems that we have with evaluation is it's very hard to trace that back to a specific thing. So, you know, I'm not going to say that the tutorial I ran in week 3 was the reason that someone got a promotion. So that's why you kind of need this holistic big picture thing of here's what we've learned and here's what we think about it, but we can't give kind of any prescriptive advice on. I don't even think that we can give prescriptive advice on what methods are the best to use in education, because it really comes down to how it's realized in these complex settings and situations that it is. So none of that gets captured by external evaluations. And if we want to understand that sort of thing, then we also have to do our own internal ones, which we're just doing all the time. We don't sort of do it as an event. We do it just as an ongoing practice.
I think, Tim, you kind of answered the second question of Tunde. I don't think that Tim has any good example that he saw of the second question.
He mentioned quite a few. That he mentioned already the examples. So in a way, you've both at the same time.
Okay. So we have another question from Zoe. Do you want to ask a question in person as well?
Okay. This is actually Pete's question.
Okay. Hi, Pete.
Hi there. I wanted to ask Tim, in data-driven education, Tim, they speak of things like critical thinking and resilience and creativity all of the time, I find. I'm working in a school at the moment, but it seems, as your paper points out, that those things are marginalized. How is it that you think they seem to, on the one hand, recognize the value of them, and on the other hand, marginalize them so much?
That is a really good question. I think that they, you know, I guess I'm not so skeptical that I think they're doing this on purpose and that they're just trying to trick everyone. Well, I think they being whatever, you know, the instances of what you're talking about seem to come about to me on the basis of a different view of what these things are: critical thinking, resilience, creativity. And this isn't quite what you're talking about, but coming back to pick on learning analytics for a moment, and I don't hate learning analytics in principle, but I think the implementations of it so far have had a lot of limitations. The idea of personalizing learning on the basis of learning analytics is kind of predicated on the idea that you categorize people into, you know, what kind of pattern of behavior do you identify with, and then personalize by nudging you in directions that are correlated with that pattern of behavior. And to me, it's sort of the opposite of personalized learning, because they're making a big assumption that you really are like that, and the next assumption is that you really should do that on the basis of being like that. Whereas I'm actually starting to get confused which paper says what, but either in this paper or another paper, I've said real personalized learning is where you actually help the learners develop practices that work for them. And then they are in charge of the way they go about things, which is sort of totally different from the data-driven thing. However, I can imagine a use of data-driven education where learning analytics and analytics of usage or engagement, if you want to call that, help the learner understand things they do that they might not notice otherwise, but then empower them to make change. So putting them in charge of their own data is the first step, I think, because at the moment institutions and third parties are the ones that control all of this. They don't say to the student, is it okay to do this with your data, or what kind of data would you like us to capture for you? It's not for the student at all. It's for the technology to be able to do things for, you know, on behalf of the student, but without asking the student what they think. So actually giving the student much more agency of their own usage data, and then helping them to understand what it means, and then helping them to understand how they might use that information to develop practices that work for them using their judgment, I think would be a much better approach. So an example would be, if my computer was able to tell me, Tim, you spend 2 hours a day quickly like sifting through online articles, and you spend an average of 15 seconds on each one, and then you end up putting like one of them into Mendeley, and then you never return to it on average, then I could sort of think, well, I wonder if that is the best thing I should be doing, or maybe I need to think about a different way forward. So that, I mean, that's an example off the top of my head where I think data-driven education that actually is part of, doesn't do the job for you, where it says this is what you should do, but sort of says here's something to think about, and then you've got some kind of dialogue with teachers that say, yeah, or peers, you know, that says, I had that same problem and I did this and now that's better and you can try it. You know, the combination of these things, I think, is where the power is. Trying to get back to your question, why do they think that it's work? I don't know. I think you sort of just buy into things, don't you? And then you look for evidence to support what you've been promoting. I'm not sure. Other people might.
I was going to say that in your paper, you write about risk aversion that results as a result of this. And that's what I see in my own practice, this fear of doing anything that may not work, whether it be pedagogy or on the part of the learner. So that's why I feel there's a real contradiction between this, you know, on the one hand, prizing critical thinking, on the other hand, making it very, very hard to actually put into practice.
Yes, and here we get back to the economic and political climate again. we are not encouraged to take risks in education because because it's big business, and we need to be able to say to the public, we have a quality assured product that's definitely going to work, and here are some guaranteed learning outcomes and graduate attributes that you'll come out of this with. So when was the last time a kind of head of department said to you, let's do something really risky, you know, an experiment that might not work? You just so that's why people are looking for these solutions, technological solutions or methodological solutions, but that doesn't sit neatly with the sort of qualities that you're talking about in your question, I think.
Thanks so much.
Great. I think Maria has some comment, and then Brett has raised his hand, and then we can have Don's here. So Maria, do you want to go first to repeat your comments?
Yeah, actually, I have two questions. One of them is partly a question, partly a comment, because even now in answering this question, you referred to the idea of the learning analytics, where you have data being collected on students' performance, and then they are put into a category which was built using data from past students and the situation they were in and all that, and then they are nudged into taking steps to remediate that. But isn't that a bit dangerous to what we are actually doing? And because this is actually happening. That is my first question. And the second question relates to the ecological evaluation, which I think you're doing a brilliant thing of evaluating ongoingly by going on to the students all the time as during the course, and even afterwards doing interviews and all that. But how much is this? Because all this is very, very time consuming. And do you have any thoughts about how can this be made more compact? And I hate to use the word efficiency, but we live in a world where efficiency is becoming a very important issue, and the way things are going, life is so fast that we have to think about efficiency. So I would like to hear your comments on these two issues, because I don't have any answers, and I'm always grappling with these things.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Two good questions. On the first one, whether the sort of nudging, data-driven nudging is dangerous, yes, I think it really is, because it's reliant on the system actually being right for a start, and who can check actually whether the system's right, because it's a black box where you don't really understand how the algorithm works that nudges the students, and therefore you can't really have a teacher who knows the student checking up on what it's doing and saying, yeah, that does sound right. You could have the student talking to the teacher about what the algorithm is suggesting, but the reality is that's probably not happening. And the nudging is also based on, as you put in your question, it's based on historical data. Which means that it is trying to replicate patterns that have happened in the past. And that's very dangerous because it closes down possibilities for doing things differently in the future. And if we think about the state of society at the moment, we we don't need that. We need to learn lessons from history and at the same time open up possibilities for learning in different ways. And I don't mean to be overly critical of learning outcomes, because I think that they are useful structural elements. But if everything is governed by predetermined outcomes, then how are we ever going to solve society's complex problems? That if we're only basing things on the way that we've learned in the past and we've thought about things in the past, rather than also exploring new possibilities that we haven't been able to predict, then how will we? Where is the place where you learn to actually deal with this complexity and these social problems that are kind of already baked into our educational systems and need a way of breaking out? Well, let me just say, is that an okay answer to the first part first?
What worries me a lot is that we are already seeing experiments with chatbots. And for me, all the more that makes me uncomfortable, because a teacher may have the results of those learning analytics and see the student and can use her own discretion and judgment. But what about situations where teachers are being replaced by chatbots? But most of what you say is answering that question as well. So yes.
Yes, I think that's right. And I've just posted a link, I think that link is right, to a paper that's cited in my paper on machine behavioralism and the problems with nudging, which is worth a read. And I think you're right to be worried. Sorry. But then, these conversations are something we need to be having so that we don't just blindly follow, oh, that's a good idea. I think, especially right now, there's a real danger that we rush into solutions because of efficiency and in order to just get through the moment, and then later realize that we've locked ourselves into ways that are problematic. So actually, it is important to be having these conversations, and probably important to put up some resistance to overtures towards efficiency. Is really hard. Moment. Sorry, did I just? Yeah, sorry. The financial implications of doing things slowly are very large at the moment, so it's difficult to resist efficiency right now. But it's important because the long-term implications of just blindly sort of going down particular paths to get through the moment are actually very problematic in the future. So to your second question about how to kind of achieve some sort of ongoing evaluation of complex education in the sort of circumstances that teachers find themselves in, first of all, you're right, it's very hard. But I guess the most practical, sensible thing I might be able to say on that is that if you had to boil all of it down into one very simple idea, I think it's that you want to just talk a lot to your fellow teachers at a program level about what they're doing and why. So that the approach to your education, what's the kind of educational ethos behind your program? Why do you have that ethos, and how do you enact it? How do you make it manifest within your program? So, for example, if programs could have a half hour, an hour chat every week that just was about, it wasn't, hugely agenda-led. It was just a discussion of what do you value in education and how are you doing that in your classes and what might you do otherwise, and sharing practices. That's still a time investment, sure, but I think that we just have to acknowledge that good teaching takes time. Good education requires an investment of time. and that probably the best way to invest that time is in ongoing dialogue at a program level with your team to make sure everyone is sort of developing these shared understandings and sharing practices.
Thanks, thanks very much. Thanks, very inspiring and very, yes, thoughtful and insightful.
Thanks. Brett, do you want to bring up your question then?
Sure. As sometimes happens, you have a question in your head, and then as you're waiting to ask it, people already start talking on the sort of territory you're thinking about. So, yes, the notions you've just been mentioning about having to specify learning outcomes in advance, and also the power of regular conversation, are actually kind of along the lines that I was thinking of. So, my reaction to some of what you were saying, and I also read the paper beforehand, like a good schoolboy, right? Were to largely agree with you. I think I would situate the problem a bit more explicitly in the territory that you seem to be a bit wary of at the start of your presentation, which was the political economic context. So I would situate it basically in what I'd call the capital system. For, you know, people might think capitalism as a broad analogy with that, which is a more famous term. And I think that you have to kind of understand what you're up against, don't you? So when we say, well, there's lots of good research, in answer to Sejin, you say, well, there's lots of good research that does examine this complexity, but then when the institutions actually come to do evaluation and other kinds of institutional initiatives, that's not reflected. You have to think, well, why? And I think the underlying reason is that the economic base here is driving a certain kind of action and driving a certain kind of, you know, it's providing a certain incentive structure. So I think for me, we have to be really explicit all the way through thinking about all of these issues, what we're up against. Now, that leads me on to, you know, probably one small criticism of a small couple of parts in your paper, and then one part which is actually really interesting, which is the main thing. So the little criticism is occasionally you say something which at a shall we say, a moral level, I agree with, of course, which is we have to trust teachers, okay? And I think you even once say, I'd struggle to rifle through the pages right now, but we have to get institutions to trust teachers, right? And it makes me think, but why would they? You know, what possible material incentive is there to be moved in that direction? You know, actually, the capital system is all about them not doing that. That's a much older value system that the capital system doesn't itself trust, right? So that's going against that entire logic. So where it led me on to a more promising strand, which I think you've just started to talk about, is what are we actually doing here with what you're calling ecological evaluation? Are we first of all saying we have to change our values, and then we lead on and we can suddenly implement ecological evaluation? Or is ecological evaluation, is this a part of the process of consciousness raising to combat this kind of isolating logic from the surrounding system that isolates students into only filling in satisfaction forms and isolates teachers into having to be performative, whatever? Is the purpose of ecological evaluation to consciousness raise and to bring people into a more collective consciousness within an institution to force institutions to change? Could this kind of evaluation be used against the institutional management in one way? It's a bit more of a combative angle on what I think you're saying in a, you know, a kind of polite kind of way, or I might be wrong, and that's kind of my question.
Excellent. So yes, the political economics filters through the whole thing and is a massive stumbling block. So if we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge the problem that of trust, first of all, I guess I would like to say, and I am not a political theorist, and that's part of the reason why I'm hesitant, right? But I would say that you can have other things happening in a capitalist system that aren't capitalist. not everything that happens in a capitalist system is necessarily capitalist. Which means that you can have some provision for trust. There is still trust in education. It's just not systemic, really. So why should institutions trust teachers? Well, I think the material argument is that trust is actually the bedrock of quality education, if you ask me. So the reason that they need to start embedding trust is to actually increase the quality of their education. So there needs to be some sort of belief on an institutional level that trust is important to the quality of education. And you need to be able to get past the risk aversion that we talked about before, because trust involves risk. And if you were in charge of an institution and you said, suddenly we're going to get rid of all the stuff that erodes trust, and we're going to start with trust as a basis, the risk is enormous, because actually some teachers aren't very good at teaching. So some programs aren't very good. Some parts of the education system aren't good, and there will be problems that come about. But you need a sort of belief that in the long term it's the right way forward, because without trust it's very difficult for these teachers to develop into good educators. And so we need trust, and then we need support, so that we're not just not blind trust saying, yeah, they'll all be fine, but a sort of trust that says, if we put the right things in place, they will develop into a position where they're fine over time. We then need kind of students and stakeholders to trust us that this process will happen and will be okay, and everyone sort of needs to trust each other. And I guess that can't happen overnight. So I like your idea that actually this is a consciousness raising. It's a way to start saying to all the different parties, we do actually need to work together on education. And to work together, we kind of need to build a relationship in which we all listen to each other, and we all start to work out how we are differently responsible for the quality of the education that comes about. And part of that is being able to look past the instrumental mindset that says, this leads to this, leads to this, and kind of see how actually we're all part of this same team or whatever. And our role is not just to provide something and then say that should be fine, but to keep in dialogue about what needs to change. And you're right, the ecological evaluation could be a way to criticize the institution, because you're not just evaluating a course, but you're evaluating the course within a program, within an institution, and saying things like, this teaching space is inadequate, or this policy is holding us back, or this faculty structure is unsustainable. Hopefully you wouldn't just do that to criticize people, because actually one of my aims in ecological evaluation is not to put responsibility squarely on the person in isolation, but to kind of understand the context in which they're operating. And as administrators and institutional leaders have loads of pressures on them. So trying to understand, not that person has done a terrible job of recruitment or whatever, but to try and say, I think going forward, we need to do something a bit differently, and here is some information, a complex and holistic view that might inform those changes. So, I mean, I totally agree that this is a bit idealistic, but I really like the idea of it being consciousness raising first.
Just to say, I liked your answer. I agree with you that capitalism is not a total system. That's actually why I tend to use the phrase the capital system, which implies it's only part of our society as opposed to capitalism. Yeah, I really like the idea that we're not blaming individuals so much as examining the structures that put individuals in particular places. That goes for the people like, coalface teachers and students, but that equally goes for senior administrators and other people. So it might even be the case over time that such a consciousness raising effort could encompass such senior administrators who might be drawn into efforts to kind of critique their own positions, discuss them with others, talk about the pressures they're under. You know, you could raise their consciousness too. They're not just the enemy, I suppose, although they might start out, you know, some people, it might start out from a position that people might view them in that way, which is always a danger, because then the institution can try and close these initiatives down, you know. But yeah, I like your answer, thank you.
Okay, Don, you kind of made a comment down there. Are you still with us? Do you want to repeat your comment or ask the question in person as well?
It wasn't really a question, it was just a response to critical thinking, because it's something that we're trying to really raise at the moment. And it's a wonderful cycle that you've mentioned, Tim, about trying to get students to develop critical thinking and that advanced way of dealing with their learning. But then we have to look at data to see who was good at it in the past, and we find that it's probably those that were engaging more. So then we have this kick of, well, how do we get the students to engage more, which then has that issue that you raised of each student has their own situation. And I was just fascinated by this whole cycle where we're trying to nudge students to engage and to behave in ways that we have seen successful students before, but actually, as you said, doesn't take into account their entire situation at home, because we're online learners. So I'm just fascinated with this cycle of how we're trying to nudge students to do things using data from successful students, and then, as you say, trying to almost move them into that sort of dangerous behaviour so that we can say, well, it raises the grades and that's all good for everybody. So it was more of a comment than a question, but I love the ecological answer that you just gave as well. And it'd be nice to see that, where people aren't trying to then blame somebody for the situation, which nearly always comes down to the poor teacher at the front. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. I think you've hit on the head. The kind of inspirational starting point for the paper really is like, stop just blaming the teacher when actually conditions are often really awful. But I agree that critical thinking is a fascinating topic to consider in relation to evaluation, because part of me thinks if we did a really good job of enculturating critical thinking into our students, we'd get much worse student satisfaction scores, because suddenly they're like criticizing our approach and critiquing the system that they're learning in, and, you know, kind of being able to understand on a much more sophisticated level the limitations of what we're doing. And I guess if you really wanted high satisfaction scores, you would try to suppress the critical thinking that your students were developing, and just find the easiest way to make them happy. So I agree. Critical thinking is a fascinating topic. And again, if you can avoid the blame of individuals, then you can open up possibilities for actually being open and honest about the system in which they're learning.
Lovely. I think we have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can slowly closing the session down. But I want to go back to your kind of question, that team that we posed to us about the practice, some of our practice being easily dataficatable, and some of them are not. And it's kind of interesting that I just try to answer your questions. I find it very difficult to answer because I don't really know what kind of data is made available about my practice even, because no one has. So the first thing is that we have to know really what kind of different data sets are produced and used in on the process of decision making at the institution and different levels, you know, our practice. Because I think that openness of data, and someone is like kind of probably someone up there, I just assume that have a lot of data about myself, and I really don't have any clue how they're evaluating my own teaching. So I find it's just interesting that how difficult it is for me to answer this, and how less I know about like the data about myself being used in this institution. So probably first step, I think that I want them to give me all the data about myself. Let me have it first, and then let me see what kind of things are on table, so I can understand how I can behave, or how I can be more critical. Because without knowing it, I find it difficult. So maybe, I don't know, just going back to the question, can we kind of recap some of the ideas here at the, like, as the way that we finish this session? Is that all right? So if any of you have anything to add, or kind of anything struck by this little exercise, can share it very briefly, and then team can maybe have another minute to finalize it. Yeah, everyone is saying sorry that they have to leave, but that's okay. We can still go on with the little number of people. Is there anyone who wants to add it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I could add more sources of data into the list, so much as I think there are two things here. One is what is being datafied now is a bit different from the long-term proposition. So when you think about the institution, a lot of this data that's being collected, we know it's not really being used at the moment, because you can see when it comes to your annual PDR or the promotion criteria or things like that, you can see what is being valued. And it's a very limited number of things. So for example, they are interested in those, I forget, but in Lancaster we have a survey that goes out at the end of every module to students, and it comes up with scores out of 5 against about 4 criteria. They are interested in you reporting those, okay? And we know that it's very, very explicit. But I think what strikes me is when you look at people who've been online, say, for a long time, and they were on Facebook for years and all sorts of other things for years. And at the time, nothing happened, it wasn't used, whatever. And now they're adults and they're kind of applying for jobs, and then the employer is finding, I don't know if it's digital footprint, digital fingerprint. There is a phrase for this which eludes me at the moment, but it's like you've actually got a digital history that's long and established that you've been building up over time. And I think that the thing to think about is, what are we setting now as this data starting to be collected that isn't being used now, but and we know it's not, because it's not being used against any of these kind of, you know, certifiable things, but could be used down the road. What kind of little footprints are we setting up to be exploited in the future? Worries me perhaps more than what's happening right now, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm not really sure whether I can agree with you, because decisions are made in a way that they sort of use some kind of data. But for me, it's not very any decision making is not very straightforward at the institution. That means that they made a decision based on certain data that I may not know. But anyway, I think that's another kind of different conversation we can just go on, probably with drink. But anyway, for now, so. Team, do you want to kind of give us that last 1 minute of response to kind of to yourself, to your own kind of discussion topic that you posed?
Yes, me responding to myself. Well, first of all, like I do agree with Brett. I think that that's a really important point. Is stuff that's being collected now might not be evident how that's being used, but it's still going to be there in the future, and it could be used in ways that we don't predict, and it can be different data sources can be combined in ways that we didn't anticipate, which can then be used for various inferences. So it does seem worrying to just allow whatever data to be collected just because we don't see it turn up in promotions processes. And on your point, Kyungmee, the thing about you not having agency and not oversight of the data that's being collected about you, I think comes back to the idea that I would like responsibility and agency to be aligned. Like you shouldn't have more responsibility than you have agency. So if you don't know what data are being collected and you can't say anything about it, it's really problematic. And I do think that a good starting point is to bring teachers in to the process of working out what data would actually be useful to inform their development. It all seems like it's summative at the moment. You know, this is a sort of summative assessment of your teaching rather than a formative one that could actually help you to develop. And the structure of evaluation is all about sort of making judgments rather than, you know, you might get the argument that it could be used formatively, but in the reality is it's not like that, is it? So I think it comes back to, let's think about responsibility in relation to the agency and the role that all of these different stakeholders have in constructing education, and how could they work together, because actually they're not enemies and they're not isolated islands. Everyone does have to kind of coordinate and collaborate in order to create educational experiences, and that involves some sort of I don't know, sophisticated understanding of what's important and some kind of shared purpose and values in order to move things in the same sort of direction. And at the moment, I feel like standardized evaluation processes and what teachers are trying to do on the ground, it's moving in different directions. And I worry that evaluation might win because of the consequences of it. So let's all keep talking about what's important and keep trying to bring in these other stakeholders, administrators and institutional leaders, to try to understand how the effects of the things that they do resonate throughout both teaching practice and the development of teaching and teachers.
All right, lovely. Thank you so much for everyone to come and talk to us. And also thanks so much, team. It was great and very thought-provoking thoughts. Yeah, we can keep having the conversation around this issue. And probably after all this crazy pandemic, it would be great to have you actually in person in our tiny little room on campus. So you can promise us you can come back later.
Yes, thank you. I would love to come down in person and meet you in the same room. I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Thanks for being both very welcoming and insightful in your questions. And I hope that was coherent, and I hope that this isn't the last contact that we have. I think it'd be nice to keep this conversation going somehow.
All right. So bye, everyone. Hope you enjoy your lunch now and have a great day. Bye. All right.